Okay, so first I'd like to give you some idea of what I plan to cover in this class. Let's start with something we already know, browsing the web. We learned how the web works from classes like CS3220. At a higher level, it's actually pretty simple. We can give a URL to a browser, either by clicking a link or entering it manually. And the browser gets three things from the URL. The protocol, which specifies the protocol the browser will use to communicate with the server. The hostname or IP address of the server. And the resource we want to retrieve from the server. Based on this, the browser will send a request to the server, and the server will map the path component in the URL to a file on disk and send it back to the browser to display. Note that in this case, we have to pre-create a file before it can be requested by a client. We call this static content. Sometimes we cannot pre-create a web page. For example, we can't pre-create a search results page because we don't know what people will search, and we can't pre-create a shopping cart page because we don't know what people will buy. In other words, we have to generate those pages dynamically, on the fly, so we call this dynamic content. At a high level, creating dynamic content is not difficult either. All we need to do is replacing the pre-created files with a program. This program will take HTTP requests as input and generate HTTP responses as output. And this program is what we call a web application, or server-side web application if we want to be more specific. Over the years, people came up with many ways to develop web applications. In the early days of the web, people used the so-called CGI scripts, or Common Gateway Interface scripts. These scripts were typically written in the programming language Perl or C, and they look like this. As we can see, the program basically produces a web page using a bunch of print statements. After a while, people realized that this is really not a good way to create web pages. It's very tedious to create a complex web page, and there's no way to check HTML syntax because they are all strings in a program. So people came up with a better idea, which is to embed code in HTML. If we think about it, this makes lots of sense. For a generated web page, most of it will be just HTML text, and the dynamic part is usually only a small portion of the page. So why don't we just create an HTML page, then put some code in it to generate the dynamic part? This approach was quite popular for a while, and many different web technologies took this approach. This is Java Server Page, or JSP. And this is Microsoft Active Server Pages, or ASP. And this is PHP. Then after a while, people realized that this approach is not too great either. The problem is that when you mix your HTML and your code, the application becomes very hard to read, to test, to reuse, or to maintain. This leads to two new approaches that try to separate presentation and processing. The first one is what I call GUI components plus event handling approach. This approach treats a web page as a collection of GUI components, like panels, buttons, input boxes, and so on. Each component has some events, like click event for buttons, and code is put into event handlers, which is separate from the page. Some major technologies use this approach, like Microsoft ASP.NET, Google Web Toolkit, and Java Server Faces. This approach does have some significant benefits. It usually provides a number of pre-built GUI components and a visual builder like this. So you can easily build up a page just by drag and drop. And because it's very similar to developing desktop applications, it makes it easier for desktop application developers to switch to web development. Unfortunately, its advantages are also its disadvantages. If you need a GUI component that's not pre-built, it's quite hard to create it yourself. Without a visual designer, building a GUI is actually pretty difficult, and by trying to be a desktop application, it's not taking full advantage of being a web application. The second approach is the MVC approach we learned in classes like CS3220. In this approach, we divide our web application into models, controllers, and views. Each handles one aspect of a web application, namely data, processing, and presentation. Comparing to the GUI components with event handling approach, MVC has been much more popular and successful. Every web programming language has at least one and usually several popular MVC web development frameworks. Here I just listed a few of them. And then AJAX was added to the mix. The idea is to use JavaScript to send HTTP requests in the background and update parts of a web page instead of reloading the whole page. AJAX was a milestone in the advancement of web technologies as it greatly improved user experience with web applications. The star of the AJAX era was jQuery, which is a JavaScript library that makes it very easy to send AJAX requests and manipulate web pages. At one point, almost 90% of the websites in the world used jQuery. It's still very widely used today. At the beginning, AJAX was used to enhance web applications built with the GUI components approach or the MVC approach. But later people realized that they could take AJAX to the extreme, meaning that instead of having some AJAX operations on each page, the whole application only has one page, and all operations are AJAX operations. And this is the so-called single-page application, or SPA. You can imagine that creating a whole application in one page requires lots of complex JavaScript. Even jQuery is not up to the task for that, so people built new JavaScript frameworks like Angular, React, and Vue. With SPA, the server-side application no longer needs to produce views, because the client side only needs one HTML page with lots of JavaScript on it. We still need a server side to handle all the AJAX requests, but instead of producing views, it only needs to produce data. This has two immediate benefits. First, because it no longer needs to generate views, it's more efficient and scalable. And second, in addition to browsers, it can now support other clients like mobile apps. So in terms of web technology evolution, this is where we are now. On the server side, often called the backend, instead of a web application, we now have a web API, which you can pretty much think of it as MVC minus the V. It's often a so-called REST web API because by following the REST principles, which we'll cover later, it's more efficient and scalable. On the client side, which is often called the front end, we can have different types of clients. We can have a SPA client running inside a browser or a mobile app running on a cell phone. Some AJAX operations in a more traditional web application or even a desktop application, all using the same backend. So for this course, these are what I want to cover. From data modeling and data access to web frameworks to the design and implementation of REST API and SPA on the front end. We'll also cover project management, security, and deployment. More specifically, we'll start with build and build tools, including make, ant, Maven, and NPM. I used to also talk about Git and GitHub in this class, but since these days Git and GitHub are covered in many other classes, we won't cover them here anymore, but you are supposed to know how to use them. And then we'll use one relational database system, MySQL, and one NoSQL database, MongoDB, and we'll cover object relational mapping and object document mapping technologies, JPA, Hibernate, and Mongoose. We'll also talk about full-text search, both full-text search provided by databases and provided by standalone solutions like Elasticsearch and Solr. We'll talk about web services, both the traditional stack with SOAP, WSDL, and UDDI, and the RESTful ones. We'll cover the most widely used Java web framework, Spring, and the Node.js web framework, Express. We'll see how to use them to implement REST Web API and do common tasks like logging, testing, and so on. For the front end, we'll cover React, which is arguably the most popular SPA technology right now. We'll use Bootstrap as our UI library. Bootstrap is covered in CS3220, so I'll assume you already know it. For security, we'll cover the security frameworks associated with the web frameworks, namely Spring Security for Spring and Passport for Express. And finally, we'll talk about how to put your application on a server or on a cloud service. So this is the plan for the course. Depending on the time and how people are taking the materials, we may end up covering more or less. Hope you'll enjoy the course. See you in the next video.